men and women shackled together, stacked on top of each other. There was a process known as tight packing, where you literally had slave trading scientists.
Slavery began to decline after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, with Britain leading the way in 1807, followed by the United States in 1808, and many other countries joining in by 1836.
Father was a slave?
He owned my grandfather and my father. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and my father had learned how to write a little bit in Richmond, Virginia before he brought him down here.
While discussions of slavery often focus on how white male owners treated enslaved people, the role of white female owners is frequently overlooked. Enslaved black people had no rights, and defying the demands of white women often resulted in severe consequences.
Beat it from him!
In this video, we will explore the suffering enslaved people endured during this dark chapter in history. Rufus, a man fighting to survive. Rufus was known by many names, but none of them spoke the full truth. Some called him a coward, others a traitor who betrayed his own people, yet these accusations missed the heart of his story. Rufus was an enslaved man, like countless others toiling under the blazing Texas sun, enduring a life that seemed designed to break him at every turn. The physical torment was relentless, but it was the sorrow that weighed on his soul that truly defined his existence. He was a father to children he could never claim, children born into bondage, seen not as his family, but as his master's property. There was a time when Rufus had resisted, a younger version of himself who burned with defiance despite the punishments. The spark within him had once felt unquenchable, a flame that refused to die. But years of cruelty, beatings that left scars on his back, and hunger that gnawed at his very being began to chip away at his resolve. Survival, he learned, came at the cost of submission. His master had turned him into a breeder, a title that stripped him of his humanity and reduced him to a tool. It didn't matter what Rufus felt, the revulsion, the shame, the pain of losing all control over his own body. To the men who held the power, he was nothing more than a means to an end, a pawn in a system designed to crush him in every imaginable way. In the early years of the 19th century, Rose Williams met Rufus, and she despised him instantly. To her, he was complicit in the system that tore families apart, reducing people to property and heartbreak. Rufus, in her eyes, was the man whose presence ensured more enslaved children were born into chains, destined to be sold off like livestock. But Rose didn't see the entire truth. Rufus, like so many others, was a victim of that same unrelenting system. Stories like Rufus's are far more common than history dares to admit. Many enslaved men were forced into the role of breeder, compelled to father children they could never protect or even claim. Yet instead of pity or understanding, they were met with blame. Their humanity was stolen from them twice over, first by the system that enslaved them, and then by the narrative that reduced them to tools of exploitation, perpetuating the ugly myth of hypersexuality. It's also important to confront a truth that history often skirts around. White women were far from innocent in this system of cruelty. They were not passive bystanders to the horrors of slavery. Wives, daughters, sisters, and mothers in slave-holding families were raised to see enslaved people as commodities, not humans. A dehumanizing lesson instilled from the moment they could understand the world around them. In some households, this indoctrination began shockingly early. Fathers would gift their infant daughters enslaved children as property, tiny human lives placed in the arms of baby girls too young to walk. By the time these girls grew into women, they fully understood what slavery meant and embraced their position of dominance without hesitation. For them, the power to control others was not questioned. It was their birthright. Former enslaved people shared stories of how white women could be even crueler than their husbands and fathers. They punished enslaved men and women without hesitation, sometimes with shocking levels of brutality. And yet, their cruelty didn't always take the form of whippings or beatings. Some white women used their power to force enslaved men into sexual submission. For these men, consent was impossible. Refusing a white woman's demands could lead to severe punishment or death. Take the story from the year 1787 in Maryland. A black enslaved man was forced at gunpoint to sleep with a free black woman. He had no choice. Saying no would have cost him his life. In the same society where enslaved people were treated like animals, Women were also seen as inferior. They had little say in their lives. Their fathers controlled them, and their husbands owned them. Women were expected to submit, to stay quiet, and to accept violence when it came their way. But how did they respond to their own oppression? They turned their frustrations downward, toward the enslaved men and women who had even less power than they did. For them, abusing enslaved people was a way to reclaim control, a way to prove their dominance. Legally, there were no protections for enslaved people. In 1859, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled that a black enslaved man could not be charged with raping an enslaved woman. Why? Because according to the law, only white women could be victims. It was a cruel loophole that revealed just how little enslaved lives mattered. Reverend Israel Massey, a man born into slavery in Emporia, remembered the horrors of those days. He spoke of how enslavers sent men to work the fields or perform other labor just to keep their wives entertained. For some men, the punishment for refusing their masters or their masters' wives was too terrible to risk. So they gave in. Men like Rufus had no freedom, no agency, and no way out. And yet, history has painted them as villains, as willing participants in their own oppression. Slavery in the US was largely upheld by white men, but white women also played a significant role. Many of them were involved in managing enslaved people and benefiting from the system. Now let's take a look at how these women contributed to the institution of slavery. White women's role in buying, selling, and managing slaves. For years, people have been told a lie, that white women during slavery were innocent, fragile, and too naive to be involved in the violence and cruelty of that time. History books paint them as passive onlookers, simply watching as their husbands, brothers, and sons mistreated enslaved people. The blame, we're told, lies squarely with the men. But Stephanie Jones Rogers' work reveals a very different truth. White women were not just participants, they were fully complicit in the exploitation and abuse of enslaved people. In her research, Jones Rogers explores the hidden lives of women in the antebellum South. These women were not innocent bystanders, they were active perpetrators of slavery's horrors. Women bought slaves, sold slaves, abused them, and in many cases treated them with more cruelty than the men. One striking example is the story of a girl named Lizzie Anna Burwell. At just 3 years old, Lizzie used the authority slavery gave her. She once demanded her father cut off the ear of Fanny, an enslaved woman. Lizzie frequently insisted on having new enslaved people who would call her mistress. This behavior was not uncommon. In Southern households, children were often taught to view enslaved people as property, objects they could hurt, trade, or control without consequence. For many white women, the size of their slave collection became a symbol of status and pride. These women didn't lose ownership of enslaved people when they got married either. Unlike other forms of property, enslaved people remained solely under the woman's name. This gave white women the power to buy, sell, and manage slaves directly from their homes. They took this role seriously. Being women didn't soften their treatment of enslaved people. In many cases, it hardened it. Historical records show countless examples of white women beating enslaved men and women, starving them, or working them to death. Some abused their slaves for sport or to exert dominance. Others were calculated and deliberate, carrying out punishments as a form of control. White women didn't just maintain the system of slavery, they strengthened it. In households across the South, women ensured that their children learned the rules of slavery early. These children saw their mothers and fathers abusing enslaved people, and they were taught to do the same. This culture of cruelty and entitlement wasn't confined to families either. In the broader Southern society, women took pride in their ownership of enslaved people. Some were even involved in the business side of slavery. Women traded slaves at auctions, negotiated prices, and managed entire plantations. They understood the system of slavery well, and they used it to their advantage. This truth, though well documented, has long been ignored. Instead, white women have been presented as helpless victims of a patriarchal society. Historians have focused on their limited rights, framing them as powerless figures under the control of their fathers and husbands. But as Jones Rogers reveals, these women found power where they could, through their control of enslaved people. Shifting from Stephanie Jones Rogers' revelations, We now turn to New Orleans, where an enslaved person took a courageous stand against the system of oppression, the fire that revealed a horrifying secret. On April 10th of 1834, a thick, dark smoke filled the streets of New Orleans, the air stinging with the heat of a building engulfed in flames. The fire raged through the streets, scorching anyone in its vicinity, and the LaLaurie Mansion, a grand building on Royal Street, seemed destined to meet its end. No one knew who had started the fire, but the damage was so severe that it was clear the mansion would not survive. Amid the chaos, Delphine LaLaurie, the mansion's owner, scrambled to salvage anything she could. She hastily packed money, jewelry, and whatever clothing she could carry, trying to move her possessions out of the house before it was too late. As the flames continued to grow, rescuers soon arrived, attempting to control the fire and save anyone still trapped inside. But in the midst of the confusion, onlookers began to ask a troubling question. Where were the slaves? Delphine LaLaurie owned a large number of African-American slaves, many of whom had belonged to her husband, Louis LaLaurie. So why was she alone, desperately trying to pack up her belongings while the fire threatened to consume the house? Among those who entered the building that day was Judge Jean-François Canonge. What he discovered inside would haunt him forever. In the kitchen, he found a 70-year-old enslaved woman, bound and wearing an iron collar around her neck. She had a deep, gaping wound on her head, and she was too weak to stand. Without hesitation, the rescuers cut her free and took her outside. It was then that she revealed a chilling secret. She had started the fire. The elderly woman explained that she had been chained in that position for an extended period, enduring constant torment. On that fateful day, she had made a choice: burn to death in the fire or face continued torture at the hands of her captors. At first, this seemed confusing. Why would she set the mansion ablaze when she could have simply escaped? The answer became clear when the woman led rescuers to the attic. What they discovered there was beyond anything they could have imagined. The attic wasn't just a storage space, it was a room of horrors. Enslaved people were found shackled, mutilated, and so emaciated that their bones were visible. Some had been strapped to tables, others were suspended by their necks, their limbs stretched and torn. A few had large patches of skin peeled away, while others were crammed into tiny cages, their limbs broken to fit the confined space. The attic revealed the sadistic reality of Delphine LaLaurie's cruelty. She had transformed it into a makeshift torture chamber, where she used her enslaved victims as experiments in pain and suffering. Many of the people found alive in that room had endured unimaginable suffering, while others had already succumbed to the horrors she inflicted. It was revealed that LaLaurie was no stranger to cruelty. She had tortured her slaves for years, and many had died under her hand. LaLaurie's ability to cause such suffering was not just physical. She was known to have a deep knowledge of how to inflict pain, using a variety of methods that would torment her victims without killing them immediately. What made her actions even more disturbing was her complete lack of remorse. When questioned about her treatment of slaves, Delphine and her husband Louis would simply dismiss it, telling anyone who dared to intervene to mind their own business. While slavery was still legal at the time, and many wealthy people in New Orleans owned slaves, there were still unspoken guidelines for how slaves should be treated. LaLaurie's actions went far beyond the accepted cruelty of the time. When the news of the discovery broke, a furious mob of local citizens gathered outside the mansion, seething with rage at the atrocities they had uncovered. The crowd, angry and relentless, tore down the mansion, destroying everything in sight. By the time the police were able to regain control, only the walls of the mansion remained standing. The story of Delphine LaLaurie remains one of the most horrifying accounts of the involvement of white women in the horrors of slavery. Now, having explored the suffering enslaved individuals endured under women like her, it's time to turn our focus to the treatment they faced at the hands of male slave owners. The hidden truth about male slave abuse. Throughout history, the truth about sexual abuse under slavery has been hidden. While the horrors of female slave abuse are often discussed, few talk about the suffering male slaves endured at the hands of their masters. Many white slave owners forcefully violated their male slaves to break their spirits, humiliate them, and strip them of any sense of self-worth. This act wasn't seen as homosexuality back then. even by the people involved. One historian, Thomas Foster, wrote about this disturbing practice. In his article, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery, he explained that male slaves experienced abuse in ways that society, both then and now, struggles to speak about. These weren't isolated events. It happened frequently, but it's a part of history that was pushed into the shadows. But why would straight white men do this? If it wasn't about being gay, what was it about? The answer is simple: dominance. Forcing male slaves into these situations wasn't about attraction. It was about crushing their pride, destroying their identity, and making them feel less than human. Slave owners used violence, humiliation, and fear to convince slaves that they were worthless. It worked. Many slaves accepted this fate because they had been taught they had no rights. They didn't know any better. And even if they did, what could they do? They weren't allowed to fight back or stand up for themselves. Take Olaudah Equiano's story, for example. Equiano, a former slave, eventually bought his freedom at 22 years old and told his story to the world. As a young boy, Equiano and his sister were kidnapped from Africa and taken to America. During the winter of 1762, Equiano met a man named Daniel Queen while traveling on a slave ship. Daniel was much older, and their relationship became complicated. Equiano admired him, even loved him, but later admitted that he didn't fully understand what was happening. It wasn't about mutual attraction. It wasn't a loving bond. Looking back, Equiano realized he had been preyed upon. Daniel took advantage of him. Another example comes from Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl. In her book, she shares the story of a young slave named Luke. Luke's life became a nightmare when his wealthy master died and he was passed down to the master's son. This man chained Luke to his bed, keeping him close at all times to satisfy his dark desires. Luke was forced to live in a shirt without pants so that he could be easily punished and violated. He spent his days and nights in chains, completely at the mercy of his owner. Jacobs described their relationship with words like freak and filthy, showing how Luke's life was stripped of dignity. Frederick Douglass, one of the most famous abolitionists, also shared his horrifying experience of abuse. In his book, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, he recounted what happened between January 1834 and Christmas of the next year. During this time, Douglass was sent to live with Edward Covey, a man known for breaking rebellious slaves. Douglass was young, defiant, and full of fight, traits his master wanted to destroy. One day, Douglass was ordered to take oxen into the woods, but being inexperienced, he ended up damaging the wagon and gate. That was all Covey needed. As punishment, Douglass was taken into a secluded part of the woods, ordered to strip and flogged. When Douglass refused, Covey attacked him. He tore off Douglass's clothes with the fierceness of a wolf and beat him like an animal. But that wasn't all. Douglass was sexually violated during these brutal attacks. Sadly, this didn't happen just once. It became routine. Covey would take Douglass to the woods, strip him, beat him, and violate him. It wasn't about sex. It was about breaking Douglass completely, his pride, his strength, his will to fight back. And it worked. When Douglass finally returned to his old master, he was a shadow of himself. The once defiant young man was subdued, beaten down, and broken. Years later, Douglass found freedom. By 1847, he had become a free man with a voice. He started an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star, where he exposed the cruel realities of slavery. In an open letter to his former master, Thomas Auld, Douglass openly spoke about the abuse he suffered at Covey's hands. He described how he was beaten and violated until he no longer felt like himself. The stories of Equiano, Luke, and Douglass are just a few examples of what many male slaves endured. These violations weren't about homosexuality, even though society sometimes tries to frame them that way. They were about power and control, pure cruelty designed to strip enslaved men of their dignity and humanity. Slave owners didn't need to be attracted to their victims. They did these things to remind their slaves that they were powerless, that they had no rights, and that they were, in their eyes, nothing but property. White women and the dark history of wet nursing. In the days of slavery, many white women despised breastfeeding their own babies. Believe it or not, they believed it made them no different from their black slaves. So instead of feeding their children themselves, they forced black women to do it. The concept of someone else breastfeeding your child might sound strange today, but back then it was incredibly common. Now here's the thing, it didn't even start with the slave trade. Before enslaved Africans were brought to America, wealthy white women often paid poorer white women to nurse their children. But when the slave trade expanded, these women found a way to avoid paying for this service. The plan was cruel but effective. Force their black female slaves to have children, take the babies away at birth, and then use these mothers to breastfeed white babies for free. For many white women, breastfeeding became lowly and uncultured because black women were seen as inferior. To make sure they had a constant supply of wet nurses, these women forced male slaves to impregnate their female slaves regularly. This way, the black women and their mistresses could give birth around the same time. But what about the black babies? The black children were often deprived of their mother's milk, leading to malnutrition, illness, and death from preventable diseases. Those who survived were neglected, as their mothers were too busy feeding someone else's child. On top of that, these babies were sold into slavery as soon as they were old enough to work. If that wasn't enough, think about the emotional damage. Babies being ripped away from their mothers at birth and raised by strangers who didn't love or care for them the same way. Sadly, this practice didn't end when slavery was abolished. Sure, slavery was technically over, but the Jim Crow laws and segregation made sure black people were still treated as less than human. Wet nursing continued, but now black women were paid, if you could even call it payment. The wages were so low that it barely made a difference. Even though they were no longer in chains, black women working as wet nurses were still mistreated. They were beaten, starved, and abused, just like during slavery. These women had to leave their own families behind to care for white babies, while their own children were left to fend for themselves. White women may have hated breastfeeding, but that didn't mean they respected the women who did it for them. For black women, wet nursing was just another way for white society to maintain power and control. Another way to remind them that, even with slavery abolished, they still weren't seen as equals. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in our next video.